universe was nothing but chaos and darkness. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. Vayar Elohim et haor ki tov. And God saw that the light was good. God gathered the primordial waters to create oceans and dry land. And Vayar Elohim ki tov. God saw that this was good. God planted grasses and plants and fruit-bearing trees that sprung up across the earth. God created the sun and the moon and suspended them in the sky. God created animals of every kind. And Vayar Elohim ki tov. God saw each piece of creation, and it was good. And when we have been created, when all of creation is complete, God saw all that God had made. V'hine tov me'od. And behold, it was very good. I spoke on Rosh Hashanah morning about this most poetic of biblical texts, the myth of creation that begins the story of Genesis. On Rosh Hashanah, I talked to you about the teachings in Genesis that all of us are created b'tselem Elohim, in God's image, and what this deep Jewish belief teaches us about how we might understand our nature as human beings and our responsibility to others. Today I want to focus on a different piece of this text in Genesis 1. Its insistence that our world is defined first and foremost by its goodness. Vayar Elohim ki tov. Over and over, this is what God tells us. Look around you, and you will see that this world that I have made is fundamentally good. I love this part of the story. I love that the Torah begins by asking us these enormous questions. What kind of world is it that we live in? Now, I'm a lifelong optimist, so I like the answer too. This is the kind of world I want to believe in. But I have to tell you, lately when I talk with you about the state of the world, you do not sound so certain about this goodness. Lately, it is harder for me to be so certain about this goodness. How do we call the world good when we need to put laminated safety cards in our pews, when we are storing evacuation maps and active shooter plans next to our prayer books? How do we call this world good when we interrupt our service to share news of tragedy from across the world? This is not what I call goodness. Instead, there's a different phrase that I've been hearing us use over and over. We use this phrase to describe the safety cards. We use it to talk about the security upgrades we have made: new doors, new buzzer systems, new security guards, along with the inconveniences and all of the costs that go along with these. We used it after Charlottesville 2 years ago, and we used it after the massacre of the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, the deadliest attack against Jews in American history. We used it 6 months after Pittsburgh when we gathered in this sanctuary to pray and mourn together after another synagogue shooting in Southern California. A terrible kind of deja vu. And I would guess that many of you heard it echoing in your hearts this morning. The phrase I've been hearing is the same phrase we use when we share the news of the Jewish students and faculty at Brandeis University whose photos appeared on a white nationalist website, and also the news of the Tufts University student who found a swastika painted on his dorm room door. It was the same phrase I heard in my heart when I read about the recent attacks on Orthodox Jews in New York, the the conservative synagogue in Berlin that was attacked last Shabbat by a man wielding a knife. And it's not on my page, but yes, also today's tragedy. This is the new reality, we say. We want our synagogue doors to be wide open and welcome, and for this sanctuary to be a place only of peace and joy. But we're living in a new reality. We need to check tickets, we need a security guard, we need to give all of you the information in those safety cards. The new reality is that Jews are targets. The new reality is that the world looks like a frightening, dangerous place. I think you know as well as I do that, in some sense, nothing about this reality is new at all. Violence and persecution of Jews is nothing new. Hatred of Jews is old, from the religious-based blood libels of medieval Christian Europe to the more modern phenomenon of ethnic anti-Semitism, typified by the hoax of the Protocols of the Elder of Zion, which was first written in Russia in 1903 and brought to America by Henry Ford 100 years ago this year. Some of you have told me stories about how you couldn't get a job at a white shoe law firm in town, or how you couldn't buy property here in Gladwin except with a straw buyer. I am part of a generation who believe that all of this was in the past, that hatred of Jews took place only in other times and other places, but never here, never now. The past few years have proven how naive this was, to have such confidence in American Jewish exceptionalism. If you have been paying attention to the news, then you know that the horrific events of this past year were not our first sign that something had changed. 5 years ago, after the attack at the Jewish Museum in Brussels, Belgium, I preached on Yom Kippur morning about the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe and the risk that it could spread here. 2 years ago, after the white nationalist rally in Charlottesville, and after a series of anti-Semitic incidents in our area, from cemeteries being desecrated to JCCs receiving bomb threats to a synagogue in northeast Philadelphia that had its stained glass windows broken, I preached on Rosh Hashanah morning about the rise of anti-Semitism and the rise of white nationalism here in our own country. The problem isn't new. The problem is simply accelerating. But it seems to me still that Pittsburgh was a tipping point for our sense of what kind of world it is exactly that we find ourselves living in. For many of us, it struck us to our very core. This sense of dread is amplified by the fact that the world seems darker for so many other reasons, too. It is not just hate speech and violence against us as Jews that is on the rise, but against so many other minorities as well. And some of us find ourselves targeted as members of more than one of these groups. There are new threats against democracy in America, in Israel, in Europe. There are threats against our children when they should be safe in school. Threats to the very earth that we live on. I'm not talking here about anxiety that is limited to any one political perspective. The American Psychological Association reported last year that 69% of Americans say that considering the nation's future causes them significant stress. 56% of Americans say that we are living at the lowest point in our country's history that they can remember. So much of what we now take for granted about the state of the world wouldn't even have been believable a few years ago. Now it's simply our new reality. It makes us question our former naivete about our security, about the world's stability. It makes it difficult to stomach the Torah's insistence over and over, Vayar Elohim ki tov, and God saw that it was good. But we are not, of course, the first generation of Jews to have this experience. We are not the first generation of Jews to find ourselves suddenly in a new, darker reality. And we are not the first generation of Jews either, I would offer, to feel distant from these words of Torah, Vayar Elohim ki tov, that proclaim the goodness of this world. This is the beauty of being part of an ancient people, an ancient chain of wisdom. We can draw strength from our forebears, and we can learn from their wisdom. So I want to tell you another story, or maybe retell a story that you already know. It's another creation story, an alternative version told by other generations of Jews who needed a story that reflected not the goodness of the world, but its brokenness. In the beginning, this other story goes, God's presence filled the universe, and there was no space where God was not present. But that omnipresence meant that there was no room for anything else, no room for God to begin creation. So, when God began to create the world, the first step needed was an act of tzimtzum, of contraction, God intentionally becoming smaller, so that for the first time, there would be space that was empty of God. The beginning of this story is almost the opposite of what it says in Genesis. It's not the goodness that is emphasized here, but a vacuum of goodness. Creation of our universe necessarily took place in that empty space, that space that was empty of God, devoid of goodness, devoid of holiness. The next part of the story is that God faced a little bit of a dilemma. God did not want to be absent from our world, but God is infinite. And so if God were simply to send God's presence into our finite world, it would overwhelm our world and destroy creation. So God sent us divine light, but packaged it in vessels that could allow the divine to shine into our world without overwhelming it. But God miscalculated. God's light was so powerful that even the vessels ended up not being strong enough to contain it. They burst from the force and they shattered, releasing the light. Much of the divine light simply returned to the source and left our world. But some of the sparks of that light clung to the broken pieces and remained here. And thus, the world that we find ourselves in, a world of broken pieces, of fragmentary sparks of light. The man who first told this story was a man named Rabbi Isaac Luria, and he lived about 500 years ago. Luria was born in Jerusalem, but the most prominent Jewish community of his day was not in the land of Israel, but across the sea in the Iberian Peninsula. Or at least it had been there until a few decades before Luria was born. The period of time known as the Golden Age of Spain, when Muslims ruled much of the region, was perhaps not so perfect as that name might suggest. But as the Middle Ages went, it was a time of remarkable tolerance, prosperity, and intellectual and religious freedom for Jews. Inspired by the creativity and the innovation of the surrounding culture, the Jewish scholars of medieval Spain were the most sophisticated in the world, and the community enjoyed something closer to freedom than other Jews in the world. But by the mid-14th century, these freedoms were replaced with increasing restrictions and persecutions. The Spanish Inquisition, and in 1492, the expulsion of all Jews from Spain, the destruction of what had been the world's leading Jewish community. It must have been a terrifying new reality. In the years since Luria first told this alternative creation story, it has been rediscovered and reinterpreted by other generations who, like Luria's generation, needed a story that acknowledged the brokenness they saw all around them. The story of the broken vessels was important to the development of 18th century Hasidut, which had to grapple with the widespread crisis of faith after the false Messiah Shabtai Tzvi. The story was popularized again in the mid-20th century by American Jews wrestling with the meaning of Jewish life after the Holocaust. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Reform Jewish thought in particular was profoundly idealistic and universalistic. The devastation of the Shoah challenged that vision of a world marching inevitably toward progress. The new reality that we contend with today, thank God, is not as dark as the history that other generations lived through. But I think that the picture that Loria paints of the world is one that resonates powerfully with the shock of this year. Does God really look at the world in 5780, at this new reality that we are living in, and see that it is good? Surely God must also be mourning the brokenness. Loria's story is not over yet. This alternative story is a story of brokenness, but it does not end with the broken. The point of the story is, in fact, that there is a way out of the brokenness. Our world is filled with the broken pieces of all these vessels, with the fragmentary sparks of God's light. And what is broken can be repaired. And this, the story continues, is our task as human beings, to pick up the broken shards, the light that yet remains in our world, still clinging to those broken pieces. Because they will still be enough to let God's light shine into our world if we could piece the broken vessels back together. In this remarkable sense, while Loria's story starts off as the opposite of the Genesis story, its ending is the same, the potential for goodness and wholeness. In Genesis, that goodness is simply present. In Loria's Midrash, it is the task of humanity to put the goodness back together again. This repair is called Tikkun Olam, the repair of the world. Perhaps you've heard of it before. We tend to talk about it a lot in Reform synagogues. While all three generations who told this story focus on the sense of brokenness at its core, the meaning of Tikkun Olam is very different in each interpretation. I think we can learn from each one as we try to shift from mourning the brokenness in this world to finding ways to repair it. The definition of Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, that we are most familiar with as Reform Jews is one that developed out of the 20th century retelling of the broken vessel story. Tikkun Olam as social justice. The way that we reclaim these sparks of God's light and repair what has been broken, in this understanding, is by engaging in public life and working to improve what is broken in our community and in our society. Tikkun Olam in this sense means to feed the hungry, to march in a protest, to work to improve our schools, to keep our children safe. But that understanding of Tikkun Olam, while most familiar to us, is not the original meaning. Isaac Luria was a mystic, and when he wrote about Tikkun Olam, he imagined not the repair of the material world, but the repair of the spiritual world. This spiritual repair is accomplished by mitzvot, by the ethical and ritual commandments of Judaism. Even studying a single verse of Torah, lighting one set of Shabbat candles, he taught, can have cosmic significance. In Chassidut, the concept of tikkun is an internal process. When the early Hasidic masters told the story of the broken vessels, they emphasized that we can repair the world by beginning with ourselves, improving our character, and purifying our souls. If we are going to be able to repair the brokenness of this new reality we live in today, we need all three of these approaches to Tikkun Olam. First, as previous generations of Reformed Jews have taught us, our faith must push us to be engaged in public life. We must speak out and demand that our elected officials take action against hate speech in our public discourse and against the spread of extremism, especially white nationalism and anti-Semitism. We have a responsibility to be involved in our local community, building bridges, showing solidarity with our neighbors of other faiths and ethnicities, and celebrating our country's diversity. We try to do this work frequently at Beth David, and your next opportunity to get involved in it is on this Sunday night as we celebrate the beginning of Sukkot with an interfaith dinner and discussion about the immigration crisis. Bring a neighbor or a coworker or a friend or a family member of a different background, a different faith, perhaps someone you know who is themselves an immigrant, and help us gather together and paint a picture of what a proudly diverse America looks like. We can do this work of Tikkun Olam by supporting organizations that do vital work to push back against hate, like Integrity for America, which is fighting white nationalism in courts, suing the Charlottesville Nazis under a law that was originally meant to protect people from the Ku Klux Klan. Or the Anti-Defamation League, which fights hate by means as diverse as defending Jewish organizations that have been targeted, training law enforcement, and teaching school children about tolerance. If you want to join me next month at the ADL's one-day summit in New York City, I would love to hear from you. Second, we must turn inward, because we can also heal the brokenness of our world by beginning with ourselves. We must ask ourselves the hard questions about the prejudices that we harbor and the small ways that we contribute to a climate of hate. To do this work, we must search our own hearts, and then we must work to do this inner tikkun through learning and through dialogue. And finally, we should remember Luria's original definition of tikkun, a repair of the spiritual realm that we can accomplish through simple acts of Jewish faith. When we study Torah, when we parse and interpret and argue with ancient texts, when we stumble on the shapes and the sounds of the ancient letters, that study has a larger significance that goes beyond ourselves. We lift up our voices in song together, and you can feel it in this room, can't you? The power of our prayers is real. We light candles on Shabbat, or we let our bellies ache from hunger on this day of atonement. And our deeds have meaning that ripple far beyond what we can see. We Reformed Jews are sometimes quick to dismiss this idea, the importance of ritual actions. But I wonder if after Pittsburgh we might more fully appreciate its meaning. When Jews are shot dead in synagogue, when Jews are shot dead simply because they are in synagogue, then the mere acts of showing up to our holy spaces and living as Jews have renewed power. On this Shabbat, on the Shabbat following the Pittsburgh attack, Beth David was one of hundreds of synagogues around the country that participated in a campaign to show up for Shabbat. We filled the sanctuary. Members of this congregation, joined by Jews who told me that they hadn't been in synagogue in decades, but they felt compelled to come now. Joined by our friends and neighbors of different faiths who spoke so beautifully and touchingly about their commitment to support us. How might you stand up to hate, to those who hate us this year, by delving in more deeply to what it means to live as a Jew? Are there Jewish spiritual practices you might explore as a kind of tikkun to the brokenness of a world where synagogues need to spend so much time focusing on security? All of this work is so far from the simplicity of Genesis. How I wish we could welcome this year simply by celebrating the goodness of the world. There is much goodness out there, friends, and we will celebrate it. But this is not that kind of year. Instead, this year demands that we be the ones to repair what has been shattered. Just as other generations found, we will be up to the task if we answer the call. Perhaps that is what God meant all along. Despite the brokenness, despite the tears, despite all the hate, still, there is goodness.